The clock is ticking for the government to reunite immigrant families separated at the border, but confusion still reigns over how that will be accomplished. Democrats are disappointed by 3 big Supreme Court decisions this week, but the real fear kicks in after Justice Kennedy announces his retirement. And plans were made, signatures collected, but are the dueling proposals for redeveloping the stadium site in Mission Valley even legal? I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, John Sepulveda, of KQED, San Francisco morning host of the California Report, KPBS business and environment reporter Eric Anderson, and Chris Genuine, editor and publisher of the Times of San Diego. Well, the chaos and outrage prompted by Donald Trump's zero-tolerance policy at the border continues. This despite Trump having backed down last week with an executive order that purportedly ends the practice of separating children from parents. Then a federal judge in San Diego this week stepped in. And John, let's start there. What did the U.S. District Judge Dana Sabra rule this week?
Basically, young kids have to be reunited with their parents within 14 days, older kids 30 days. A couple interesting things, though, about this. The first, I was told by several sources that the judge actually wrote this decision themselves, and that's really key because often these judges have the clerks write it. So they really wanted it to withhold later scrutiny and later review. The second thing is I've spoke to other lawyers who are outside of this court ruling, but who represent kids all across the country right now, from New York all the way to Houston and into El Cajon, Lemon Grove. There are kids there. They can't find their clients. And so there's a legitimate question that if these attorneys who are contracted by the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is holding these kids, can't find their clients, how can the government?
Exactly, and a strongly worded ruling. What did he say about the Trump administration's actions?
He was not a fan of the Trump administration's actions, but what was actually interesting, again, going back to it, is the restraint he showed, because let's keep in mind that there is expected to be various reviews and appeals of this decision in various ways, and that also the setting for this and the idea that parents are being torn from children is a very emotional issue. And so while there was some very stern words against the Trump administration, it really seemed to focus a lot on the actual legal basis for why they ruled that way.
Yeah, he said something about the facts portray reactive governance and responses to chaos of the government's own making.
And I'm glad you brought that up, and I'm sorry I missed the point when you were trying to coach me there, but the ACLU, there is a theory within the lawyers of the ACLU which have brought this suit that essentially the zero tolerance started in response to a suit that they brought. So if you look at the timeline of it, there was the suit that the ACLU brought on behalf of a Congolese woman. Then as they were looking at this, they found out it was a class action status because there were so many people involved who were separated. And then after it looked very bad in arguments for the suit, then the Department of Justice announced this zero tolerance ruling as a way to kind of give cover to a practice they were already doing.
Okay, Eric?
So where are we now with the actual people who are still crossing the border today? What's happening with them?
That's a great question, Eric, and I wish I could answer it. Part of the reason I can't is because Border Patrol can't answer it, and Border Patrol has given mixed messages. So we know that, for example, in Houston, the head of Border Patrol in that sector said they will no longer refer prosecutions. But when I was speaking, of these people crossing, if they're not referring the prosecutions, then there's no reason to separate the families. I got stopped by Border Patrol yesterday when I was in the Yuma sector, talked to someone at Border Patrol, and they said, no, we are very much still sending these for prosecution. If the families are not separated, and we're actually, I'd like to say that, for example, the foster care facility in Lemon Grove, I had 2 workers tell me that they are still receiving separated children when they have beds empty. But if the separation has indeed stopped, then we're looking, if there's prosecution, then we're looking at families being housed together, and that creates a whole other set of problems. Long answer, but the bottom line is it's complicated.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
Is there any indication that there's some catch and release going on again under the circumstances?
Well, I'm hesitant to use the term catch and release because it just describes what we do with an animal, and humans aren't animals. But that aside, there is indications in some sectors, for example, in Brownsville, that they're being detained, if you will, and then being let go and with different types of bail requirements when they're in a family situation. But if you go to El Centro, there's some indication that that's not happening. So again, we're not getting a lot of answers. And last thing I'll say about this is it's been really hard because they're not giving us a lot of information. And so journalists are doing some very strange things now, things that are unethical. For example, in Yuma.
Yeah, give us an example of it.
In Yuma, we saw that 3 network reporters posed as translators, according to the Border Patrol, and essentially tried to sneak in one was able to get through, overheard protected privileged conversation between the attorney and the client. That's not ethical, it's not appropriate, it's not acceptable. At the same time, and this is not an excuse, but at the same time we're getting no information from the federal government, and when we do, it often conflicts with each other.
Real frustrated on the lack of transparency.
Yes.
Now, speaking of legal actions and all, another class action suit filed just today connected with a florist decision. I know that gets way into the weeds, but tell us what you can briefly on that.
Just very briefly, this class action is looking to protect children who either are in current detention or who are put in detention as a result of the zero tolerance policy. Flores, for the viewers and the listeners who don't know, it is the court agreement that kind of guides the child welfare and in most cases prohibits keeping a child for more than 20 days. The government would like to change that. Obviously, these advocates would not. There's really nothing new in this suit that caught my eye. Eric, I don't know if you got a chance to read it. I know you follow this. But there wasn't anything bombshells that I saw that somehow signified it.
But there was a report this week by Reveal, the investigative journalism center, about in a Texas detention center, kids being forcibly given psychotropic drugs. Tell us about that report.
So actually, I contributed to that report. Basically, it is what it says. They were using, there were some foster care facilities in Texas and other places that were essentially giving kids, if you've ever been on a long car ride with a child and they don't stop crying, every parent has thought, maybe I should give them some Benadryl and just get them to, they were doing this in permanent capacity, essentially chemical restraints. And they didn't label it as such, they didn't say as such. And what has happened is not only are those kids unable to help themselves with their own placement, but there are rules governing any type of restraint, including chemical restraint. Moreover, these children did not display, according to our reporting, did not display any issues that should have warranted psychotropic drugs.
So this could be another story that gets some traction in the national press soon.
Absolutely, but I do want to make something very clear to the folks who are wondering about the shelters here in El Cajon and Lemon Grove. KQED and our partners went and visited them after when things kind of had died down as far as the media glare. Gene Guerrero did a great report of KPBS about the El Cajon facility. We have found no indication that any of those types of abuses we're seeing in Texas happening here in San Diego County.
All right. Another story you did this week about the immigration policies putting a dent in California's agricultural labor force.
Yeah, so I mean that's a huge one. Right now, we are seeing in northern county San Diego, where the flowers are grown, for example. We are seeing in Watsonville and Santa Cruz County, where strawberries are picked, up to the Napa Vineyards, to the Salinas Valley. We're seeing a lack of migrant labor, and that's because normally the migrants would often come through Yuma. They would cross. They would either come on a visa, or they would overstay their visa, but they are not crossing anymore. And there's a couple of different reasons for it. First of all, California is really expensive, and a lot of them can't afford it on a migrant salary. But more to the point, there is a legitimate fear and a lot of confusion about the Trump administration's policies. And when I talk to people who are monitoring farm worker status, who are on the ground there running these companies, they say, you know what, this fear is keeping them from coming here.
All right.
And
Eric?
just one more quick issue. Politically, this issue really took off a couple of weeks ago, burned very, very brightly, and it seems to have subsided a little bit now. Does it get more complicated to energize viewers and listeners when you start to talk about court rulings or specific cases? Or
Yeah, I mean, and I'm saying this as somebody who loves news, who grew up listening to KPBS, but when people talk about court rulings, I'm just like, I fall asleep half the time. That is part of it. We can understand at a base level the horror and the fear to be a child or a parent and have that separation. We start talking about court cases, whether the detention, getting into and I think that that's been one of the incredible challenges on this. I'm hearing from a lot of folks who said this has been happening in various forms for years. Why didn't anyone care then? I really think that the visual images of the story of, and just hearing that audio, I think really caused a lot of people to take notice.
All right, one last question before you run out of time on this segment. We talked about due process. The president has said due process is getting in the way. Let's get rid of this asylum law. Let's just kick people out without due process. I mean, might that spark some national debate again?
Yeah, I mean, is there anything the president says that doesn't spark some kind of national debate?
He does suck the attention, doesn't he?
I think that the key is that we signed a treaty because we were committed, and they remind you that this was a treaty negotiated at a time when American values were very much at the forefront of trying to put them on the world stage. The short answer is if we pull out of this treaty, first of all, if it is allowed to happen, which I don't know, or if we don't uphold to it, it's going to label us as a country that it's going to be very damaging. Let me just say that. The other thing too is the fact of the matter is we're not giving people due process. I was down at the San Ysidro Port of Entry on the Chaparral side. I saw 13 mothers present themselves to Border Patrol. And the Border Patrol agent in charge did the equivalent of like when you're a little kid and you go, I can't hear you. You know what I mean? Like literally saw them, was like, and then ran the other way. When when a person seeking asylum presents themselves to Border Patrol is supposed to inform them how they can apply for this asylum and do so within, a manner that is within the bounds and
what
the spirit
the process
of the law.
is.
It's not an illegal act.
Right.
No, it's not an illegal act.
Well, we're going to move on, but plenty to talk about here in the weeks ahead. Thanks for coming down and joining us today. Appreciate it. Well, rumors of an opening on the Supreme Court were confirmed this week when Justice Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement. Often a swing vote, Kennedy leaves an opportunity for Donald Trump to firm up the 5-4 conservative majority on the court with profound implications for all Americans. Now, Chris, are the Democrats as powerless as they appear in this?
It's really going to be tough for the Democrats thanks to the nuclear option, which allows judicial confirmations to be done with only 51 votes.
Otherwise, they'd need 60.
Otherwise, they would need 60. That was the way it used to be done. That was the way that many Supreme Court, in fact, all the previous Supreme Court justices before the latest have been confirmed. 51 is exactly the number of Republican senators, of course. There are 3 independently minded Republicans who might vote against a right-wing nominee. Of course, John McCain, but he's battling cancer. Lisa Murkowski
of
Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine. On the other hand, there are 3 senators who are Democrats who face re-election in staunch Trump voting states. So Joe Donnelly in Indiana, Joe Manchin in West Virginia, Heidi Heitkamp. So it's going to be a battle. But I think the Republicans also know, Trump certainly knows this, that majority of Americans want to preserve Roe versus Wade, don't want the most right-wing of candidates for Supreme Court. So I think there's a likelihood it will be some kind of centrist, slightly to the right judge who is nominated for this.
Maybe Merrick Garland, who President Obama had nominated, huh?
Exactly. And throughout 2016, the Democrats tried to secure his nomination. Mitch McConnell said, no, we're going to wait till there's an election.
Yeah, so don't look for Mr. Garland to be nominated anytime soon. Well, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and California Senator Kamala Harris, other Democrats say McConnell must adhere to his own rules here and not nominate Kennedy's replacement during this election year. We got a soundbite here from Chuck Schumer on the floor of the Senate this week.
Millions of people are just months away from determining the senators who should vote to confirm or reject the president's nominee, and their voices deserve to be heard now, as Leader McConnell thought they should deserve to be heard then. Anything but that would be the absolute height of hypocrisy.
Well, in fact, Mitch McConnell says this election year is different. Here's one of his tweets from 2016, though. The next justice could dramatically change the direction of the Supreme Court for decades. The American people deserve a voice in that conversation. A bit of hypocrisy here, as Schumer was saying.
Well, the fact of the matter is there's precedent for nominating and confirming a Supreme Court justice during a midterm year. President Obama did it with Elena Kagan back in 2010. So it's a difficult argument to make. Now, there has been some discussion of fighting this in some other way. Maybe Democrats like Kamala Harris could boycott the hearings, but it doesn't seem like the Democrats can do much more than to try to lobby Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski.
The court of public opinion, we saw it come up with the whole Obamacare debate last year. A lot of people credit that with that falling just short of being overturned in the legislative process.
That could definitely have an impact. I mean, I think that again, it's going to be difficult. Let's take a very right-wing candidate who maybe says publicly that he's against Roe versus Wade. That's going to certainly weigh on the two female senators who have reasons beyond just party politics. They're women. They care about reproductive rights, presumably, perhaps more so than the male members of the Senate.
Talking about the Republican senators, right?
Right.
So
Exactly.
Right, and Collins.
She already said today, in fact, that if Roe v. Wade is an issue, that's a do or die issue for her.
But they have a way of not answering those questions in those confirmation processes.
Sure.
Exactly.
Right? I thought it was interesting, though, that that some people were kind of putting the Republican women in the Senate on as kind of balancing that fulcrum, right? They're gonna, they have the potential to make a decision on this nominee or have influence that they might not otherwise have.
They had the same kind of impact with some of the votes on Obamacare, so I think that's significant. I mean, they're going to get a lot. They're going to face a lot of lobbying from the Democrats, and likewise, those three Democrats in pro-Trump states are going to face a lot of lobbying from the Republicans.
Now, Kennedy has been kind of an independent mind, issues like same-sex marriage and abortion rights, but he certainly showed his conservative colors in recent decisions in this particular term before he resigned.
In fact, just this week. So if you look at his record, he was the swing vote on social and cultural issues. Gay rights, racial discrimination, certainly in upholding Roe versus Wade. But in most other examples, he was a conservative. He voted against Obamacare. On the key Obamacare vote, it was just Chief Justice John Roberts who was the swing vote.
He really saved that one, yeah.
And in fact,
Obama.
There's a lot of there's some speculation out there that Roberts, who really is a moderate, comes off as the swing vote in the future. The most recent examples of where Kennedy voted, the union fees for political employee unions and Trump's third travel ban. He voted he voted with the Republican conservative majority.
Yeah. John?
I'm just wondering, based on your experience, it seems that we're in a much more nakedly political time. I can remember a time when we wouldn't necessarily ask directly how a judge wouldn't rule or would not rule on an issue. And now it's very clear that, you know, with the election of President Trump and others, Democrats have done it too, that they'll support a candidate, a nomination for the judiciary where ideological leanings really matter.
Really come into play.
I think it is we live in a much more divisive time, and on the Supreme Court, there's this. You have, for example, another judge who could certainly retire very soon. So I think there is the real concern that every voice on the Supreme Court counts, and certainly among Trump's Republican base. They were looking for, when Trump said early on, I want to appoint conservative justices, that was really something that drew out the base. And I think it's something he's hoping for during the midterm
And it could work for the Democrats.
Right.
Any possibility Democrats are more motivated because of this in the midterms? The idea that this is going to be lining up, we've seen that the polling that shows that Republicans have been getting ground is because Democratic enthusiasm has dropped.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's interesting that Mitch McConnell said he would consider the confirmation in the fall, kind of a vague answer. He didn't mean after the election. He meant perhaps making it as late as possible to energize the Republican base. But a right-wing nominee would also energize the Democrats and, more importantly, the independents. And if you add up Democrats and independents, they're twice as many as Republicans. That really could produce that blue wave that people have talked about.
Well, we'll see what happens there. We're out of time on this segment, but it's going to be very interesting. And San Diego voters in November are going to face the unusual prospect of deciding a major land use issue via ballot box. And maybe we're talking development of the big stadium site in Mission Valley, of course, specifically two competing proposals, one by Soccer City, one by San Diego State University Friends. And now comes the city attorney, Mara Elliott, tossing a big fat wrench into the works. Eric, a little thumbnail. Tell us the two proposals briefly, and then what's the city attorney's objection here?
Well, thank goodness for Mara Elliott for keeping the summer interesting this year.
There you
go. It's very nice. Well, basically what you have is you have two development groups. About a year and a half ago, FS Investors decided they wanted to redevelop the stadium site. They came public with their proposal shortly after the Chargers had announced that they were going to leave town, and they said, look, we'd love to be able to redevelop this site. We want to build housing. We want to put commercial space in. We'll build you a river park. We want to build a sports stadium, and we want to lure a Major League Soccer team here. They were within talks with San Diego State University at that time. Those talks broke off during the course of that year, and another effort emerged publicly, and that was Friends of SDSU, who said, well, we'd like to see this land sold to San Diego State University. They want to buy 130 acres of that, turn it into an auxiliary campus that has many of the same things that Soccer City has. It's the housing, the commercial space, the sports stadium, the river park. And so these two ideas kind of coalesced around ballot measures. Petition signatures were signed. They were brought before the city council. The city council did what they could do. They had no choice, really. Either they could approve the measure or put it on the ballot. Both the issues ended up on the ballot in November. And so, end of story until November, right? Except,
what's the city attorney's
right? The city attorney says, "Wait a minute, I have serious concerns." She issued after the Soccer City proposal came out, she issued a public document that said, "Look, these are the concerns I have. I think it's, it violates the city's ability to manage the property. It violates state law. It's too specific in these points." She issued a similar opinion about the SDSU West proposal, and she felt that it had some of the same concerns there, but thought that the proposal was too vague. It wasn't specific enough. It didn't protect the city's interest enough. And so what she decided to do this summer is go to the city council, get their blessing. They voted 6-3 in a closed session back in April to go ahead and ask a judge to remove both of these measures from the ballot. These are voter-approved measures. More than 100,000 voters each approved them. To put them on the ballot. And she says no, she wants the judge to take the measures off the ballot and review whether or not they're legal. And that's kind of where we are now.
And what's the timetable on that? When will they hit a court?
We're going to find out actually relatively soon, early in July, the first of the two measures, different judges, different courtrooms. The first of the two measures gets a hearing, the SDSU West measure, I believe it is. And then a couple of weeks later, the second measure will get a hearing. So we'll know by the end of July.
And this is pretty unusual, right? You talked to the previous city attorney about this. And
it is. It's not something that happens very often because I think that city officials are not of the mind to deny the will of the voters, which it seems to. And we did talk to the former city attorney, Jan Goldsmith, about this, and this is what he had to say.
Okay.
The judge has to think carefully about doing that. But if you do it, what about the appellate rights? And while the one that's thrown off the ballot appeals, what happens to this other one? Because then that one gets challenged if it passes on the basis that, well, we had both of them and one was illegally thrown off the ballot. It has the potential of being a can of worms.
Can of worms. The scenario he's talking about is if one gets thrown off and the other one remains on, then it creates all kinds of legal tension. And Jan also expressed some concern about, who's paying for this. The city hired outside counsel. They brought in an outside legal firm to help adjudicate this, and so they're going to pay those attorneys' fees. They're going to pay their own attorneys. Yeah,
I mean, I think your report was $100,000 or something like that.
A couple $100,000. It could be bigger because if there are challenges later, the city could be on the hook for those challenges.
And what's the betting line? Is a judge likely to kick these things off the ballot with all those signatures?
Nobody really knows what a specific judge is going to do on a specific case. I think a lot depends on the arguments that are presented, but we do know, just from past precedent, ballot measures have been challenged before, and it has to be a pretty high bar. It has to be pretty obviously wrong or illegal for a judge to say, look, this just isn't going to pass muster. So I think the bar is pretty high for her to make that case, so there is a chance that both of those measures could still be on the ballot in November.
Is there a higher level motivation here?
Political motivation?
Political motivation?
Well, it's a very good question, and we'll kind of leave it there. We don't. One thing we do know is we didn't get a chance to sit down with Mara to talk to her about those issues.
Yeah, why wouldn't she answer questions on that?
It was along with the actual legal action. I thought the way it was presented was unusual. She released the information on her website. Couched the action as a legal review, saying she wanted to protect the voters, here's why, and she just wanted a judge to look it over as the impression. But when you sit down and read the writ of mandate, the writ of mandate says very clearly early on, what I want you to do is to take us off the
Well, hold that thought, John, because we're out of time, but we're going to see how this plays out. Another fascinating story to follow up on. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, John Sepulveda of the California Report, Eric Anderson of KPBS News, and Chris Genuine of the Times of San Diego. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.